Boston, Massachusetts, June 1962. An apartment building on Gainsborough Street. A neighbor notices something wrong and calls the police. Inside the apartment, they find the body of Anna Sleezers, a 55-year-old Latvian seamstress who had lived quietly in her apartment, who sewed for a living, who had survived the upheaval of post-war Europe and built a modest, careful life for herself in a new country. She has been strangled. The manner of the crime is specific enough that detectives take note. Over the next 18 months, 12 more women will be found strangled in their apartments across Boston. A city of nearly 1 million people will lock its doors, stop answering buzzers, and live in a specific, suffocating kind of fear. A man will eventually confess to all 13 murders. And decades later, forensic investigators will look at that confession and ask, did he actually do it? Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. And tonight, we're going to Boston, early 1960s, a city paralyzed by fear and one of the most complicated murder investigations in American history. Because the Boston Strangler case is not just a story about a serial killer. It's a story about a confession that may not have been true and a case that may never have been properly solved. So get comfortable. We're going to take our time with this one. It deserves it. How do you solve 13 murders when your only evidence is a confession from a man who was never tried for the crimes? Did Albert DeSalvo actually kill the women he confessed to killing, or did he confess for reasons that had nothing to do with guilt? And what does it mean for the families of 13 women that the case may never truly be closed? Boston, 1962. A major American city in the early years of the Kennedy administration. Prosperous, proud of its history, home to some of the finest universities in the world. A city that understood itself as serious and accomplished and old in the best possible sense. The Freedom Trail wound through its streets. Harvard and MIT sat just across the river. The accent was distinct and the civic pride was fierce. And beginning in the summer of 1962, this city became home to a serial killer who was entering women's apartments and strangling them, leaving almost no useful evidence. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 85. They lived in different neighborhoods. They had no obvious connection to each other. The police, working without DNA evidence, without the computerized databases of modern law enforcement, without a coherent theory of serial killers that wouldn't be developed for another decade, were almost completely at a loss. This is where our story begins. Chapter 1. The murders begin. It was a Saturday evening in June when the city of Boston first heard the name that would define its nightmares for the next year and a half. June 14, 1962. The apartment building at 77 Gainsborough Street in the Fenway neighborhood. Anna Sleezers had been expecting her son, Juris, for dinner that evening. When he arrived and knocked and got no answer, he tried the door. It was unlocked. He found his mother on the bathroom floor. Anna Sleezers was 55 years old. She had been born in Latvia, had come to the United States as a displaced person after the Second World War, one of the hundreds of thousands of Europeans who had been upended by the war and found their way to American cities in the late 1940s and early 1950s. She was a seamstress. She attended church. She lived simply and independently. She had a son who came to visit her for dinner. She was the kind of person who exists in the texture of every city. A quiet life, not famous for anything, not remarkable in any way that the newspapers would normally notice. She deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved better than what came after, too. The way her death would be transformed into a story that was more interested in its own horror than in the woman at the center of it. The manner of her death was unusual enough to put the detectives on immediate alert. There was no sign of forced entry. The apartment had not been ransacked in the way that a burglary gone wrong typically looks. Nothing of obvious value had been taken. The ligature used to strangle her was the belt from her own housecoat. The positioning of the body suggested that whoever had done this had taken their time. The detectives who worked the scene were experienced enough to recognize that this had the hallmarks of something deliberate and specific, not opportunistic, not panicked, not accidental. Someone had come here for a purpose. At that stage, it was one terrible murder. A city the size of Boston has terrible murders. The investigation began in the way that murder investigations always began, detectives canvassing the building, talking to neighbors, trying to establish who Anna Sleezers knew, who might have had reason to harm her, who had been seen in the building in the days before her death. It was painstaking work and it produced very little. No one had seen anything particularly helpful. No one knew of anyone who would have wanted to hurt her. Then, 16 days later, on June 30th, 1962, Boston had two more. Nina Nichols was 68 years old, a retired physiotherapist who lived in an apartment on Commonwealth Avenue in Brighton, a respectable, tree-lined street, the kind of address that suggested a woman who had worked hard and built a comfortable retirement for herself. She was found by her brother-in-law, who had come to pick her up for dinner. The similarity to the Sleezers case was immediate and unmistakable. No forced entry. No sign of robbery. She had been strangled with her own nylon stockings. That same day, the same day, Helen Blake was found in her apartment in Lynn, just north of Boston. She was 65 years old, a retired nurse. The method was the same. The absence of forced entry was the same. The careful, deliberate quality of the scene was the same. Two women on the same day. And the earlier death of Anna Sleezers, just over 2 weeks before. The detectives looking at these three cases now understood that they were almost certainly looking at the same person, and that person was not finished. The summer of 1962 continued to be terrible. On August 19th, Ida Erga was found in her apartment in the West End. She was 75 years old, a widow. On August 20th, again, the very next day, Jane Sullivan was found in Dorchester. She was 67. The investigation was now looking at 5 murders in a little over 2 months, and the pattern that investigators could identify was deeply unsettling. The victims were older women, living alone, in different parts of the city and its surrounding areas, and the killer was somehow getting inside their apartments without forcing his way in. That last detail is the one that haunted investigators most in those early months. A killer who breaks a window or forces a lock is frightening, but at least the mechanism is understood. You can tell people to add better locks, to put bars on windows, to take physical precautions. A killer who somehow persuades his victims to let him in is a different problem entirely. It means the danger is not a physical vulnerability in your home. It means the danger is in the moment of judgment when a person decides whether or not to open a door to a stranger. It means the killer is somehow disarming or persuasive or presenting himself in a way that seems legitimate. And there is no lock that defends against that. Boston began to change its behavior. Women who lived alone stopped answering their doors unless they were certain who was on the other side. Building managers began instructing residents not to buzz anyone in who hadn't been specifically invited. Women who had always felt comfortable in their own apartments began keeping their doors bolted even when they were home. Friends called each other more often. The simple act of coming home and unlocking your door took on a weight it had never had before. What is worth sitting with for a moment, before we go further into the case itself, is what that kind of fear actually feels like to live inside. The Boston Strangler murders were not random street violence. They were not muggings gone wrong or drive-by shootings or any of the forms of urban violence that feel terrible but at least follow a geography that can be navigated around. This was violence inside homes. Inside the one place that is supposed to be safe. The fear that settled over Boston in the summer and autumn of 1962 was the specific, unshakable fear of sanctuary violated, the knowledge that being inside, behind a locked door, was no longer a guarantee of safety. You cannot stay safe from something that comes to find you in your own apartment. The investigation expanded. The Boston Police Department was coordinating with departments in neighboring cities. Lynn, where Helen Blake had been found, was in a different jurisdiction. Attorney General Edward Brooke, who would later go on to become the first African American elected to the U.S. Senate by popular vote, recognized that the case required coordination at a level beyond what the individual departments could manage and created a special unit to bring the investigations together. This was a significant step, but it couldn't solve the fundamental problem. There was almost no physical evidence, and the investigators had no coherent theory of who this person was or how to find him. Into the autumn of 1962, 2 more murders. Sophie Clark, 20 years old, a student at the Carnegie Institute of Medical Technology, was found in her apartment on December 5th. She was African American, and she was significantly younger than the previous victims, a detail that investigators noticed and that would later contribute to doubts about whether all the murders were connected. Pamela Blake, 25 years old, was found shortly after. The age of the victims was dropping. If it was the same person, something seemed to be shifting. The new year brought more. By the time 1963 was finished, the total would stand at 12 women. And in January 1964, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan would be found in her apartment on Charles Street in Beacon Hill, and the number would become 13. The city that had begun the summer of 1962 with that ordinary kind of urban confidence, proud of its universities, proud of its history, proud of its harbor, had spent 18 months living in a fear it didn't know how to escape. 13 women were dead. The police had no suspect. And somewhere in the city, the man who had done this, or perhaps more than one man as some investigators were already beginning to suspect, was still walking around. The Boston Strangler murders had begun, and the investigation that would follow them would prove, in some ways, to be as troubling as the murders themselves. If you're finding this as fascinating and disturbing as I do, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. New sleep history stories every Thursday and Sunday on the Still Hour. And if you'd rather listen on Spotify, we're there too, link in the description. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Back to Boston. Because 13 murders in 18 months is only the beginning of this story. Chapter 2. The Victims. There is a problem with how serial killer cases tend to be told, and it is worth naming it directly before we go any further. The tendency, especially in the era when the Boston Strangler murders were committed and investigated, was to focus on the killer, on his psychology, his methods, his apparent invisibility. The victims, in too many accounts of cases like this one, became a kind of background detail. A number. A list of names that established the scale of what happened before the story moved on to the person who did it. This account is going to resist that tendency because the 13 women who were killed in Boston between June 1962 and January 1964 were not background detail. They were people with specific lives and specific histories and specific people who loved them and grieved them. And the way those lives get handled in the telling of this case matters, not just as a question of decency, but because understanding who the victims were turns out to be genuinely important to understanding what happened and whether it was even the work of a single killer. So, the 13 women. Anna Sleezers, 55, the Latvian seamstress on Gainsborough Street. We've already met her. She had come to America from a country that no longer existed in the form she had known it. Latvia had been absorbed into the Soviet sphere after the war, and the displaced persons who made it to the United States brought with them the particular resilience of people who had survived the worst the 20th century had to offer. She had built a quiet life. She had a son who visited her for dinner. Nina Nichols was 68, a retired physiotherapist. She had spent her working life in the care of other people's physical well-being. She lived on Commonwealth Avenue, that long, elegant boulevard that runs through the heart of Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. Not a wealthy address exactly, but a respectable one, the kind of street where a woman who had worked hard and saved carefully could afford a comfortable apartment in her retirement. She had dinner plans on the evening she died. Helen Blake, 65, a retired nurse. She had lived and worked in Lynn, just north of the city, a working-class community that has always felt the pride and occasional condescension of its proximity to Boston proper. She had spent her career, like Nina Nichols, taking care of others. She lived alone. She was careful and independent. Ida Erga, 75, a widow in the West End. She is one of the victims most easily lost in the telling of this story because the West End itself had, by 1962, been largely destroyed by urban renewal. The old neighborhood of tenements and small businesses had been bulldozed in the late 1950s in one of those sweeping urban redevelopment projects that the era believed in completely and that later generations would largely regard as catastrophic. The West End's old residents had scattered across the city. Ida Erga was one of them, still living in what remained of a neighborhood that no longer quite existed. She was 75 years old and she lived alone and she was somebody's mother and somebody's grandmother and she deserved a great deal more than the ending she got. Jane Sullivan, 67, found in Dorchester. She had worked as a nurse's aide. Of all the early victims, Jane Sullivan's case presented perhaps the greatest forensic challenges. She had been dead for nearly 2 weeks before she was found, which limited what investigators could determine about the circumstances of her death. The fact that a woman of 67 could lie dead in her apartment for nearly 2 weeks without anyone noticing is its own quiet tragedy, a comment on the particular loneliness that is possible even inside a major city. Sophie Clark, 20, was the victim who most clearly broke the pattern of the earlier murders, and for many investigators, her case raised the first serious doubts about whether a single killer was responsible. The early victims had all been older women, between their mid-50s and mid-70s. Sophie Clark was 20 years old, a student, African-American, living with 2 roommates in an apartment on Huntington Avenue. The profile was so different from the earlier victims that some detectives felt strongly that her murder was not connected to the others, that it had been attributed to the strangler almost by default, because the city was in a state of heightened fear and strangling was the method. Sophie Clark had been studying to become a medical technologist. She was going to have a career in healthcare. She was 20 years old. Pamela Mason, 25, was found in Cambridge. She was young, like Sophie Clark, and her death created the same dissonance with the older victims that Clark's had. She worked as a photographer's model and receptionist, lived alone, had moved to Boston from out of state. Beverly Simons, 23, was a graduate student at Boston University who had been strangled and also stabbed, a detail that distinguished her case from the others and led some investigators to argue, again, that she had not been killed by the same person. She was a singer who performed at local churches. She was working toward a career in music therapy. Evelyn Corbin, 58, a divorcee living in Salem, further from the Boston city limits than the earlier victims, which raised its own questions about whether the killer's range was expanding or whether investigators were drawing a net too wide and catching crimes that didn't belong together. Joanne Graff, 23, was found in Lawrence, Massachusetts, even further north, another young woman, another case with details that some investigators felt didn't fit the established pattern. She was a designer who had recently moved to the area. Anne Mary Sullivan, 19 years old, found in her apartment on Charles Street in Beacon Hill on January 4, 1964. She had been in Boston for less than a month, having moved from Cape Cod. She was, by almost every account, the last victim attributed to the Boston Strangler, and she was, in many ways, the victim whose case would eventually drive the most serious modern effort to resolve the question of whether Albert DeSalvo had actually been responsible. What the list of victims tells us, if we read it carefully, is that the pattern is far more complicated than it initially appears. The early victims were older women, in their late 50s, 60s, and 70s, who lived alone in apartments spread across the city. The later victims were dramatically younger, some still students or recent arrivals in the city. They lived in different parts of the greater Boston area. Some of the crime scenes had features that the others didn't. From very early on, serious investigators were asking whether they were looking at one killer or several, and whether the assumption that all 13 murders were connected was an investigative conclusion that the evidence actually supported, or a simplification that had calcified into accepted fact because the city needed a story that made sense. The victims deserved an investigation that asked those questions rigorously. Whether they got one is a question we'll spend the rest of this story trying to answer. Chapter 3. The Investigation. Let's be clear about something before we start talking about how the Boston Strangler case was investigated. The police and prosecutors and investigators who worked this case were not incompetent. They were not indifferent. They were not lazy. They were experienced, often dedicated professionals who worked enormous hours on a case that was generating constant public pressure and media attention, and they did what they could with what they had. What they had was extraordinarily limited by modern standards. And understanding those limitations is essential to understanding why the case went the way it did. In 1962, forensic science as we understand it today barely existed. There was no DNA analysis, the technique that would eventually revolutionize both the solving of crimes and the exoneration of wrongly convicted people wouldn't be applied to criminal investigations until the mid-1980s. There were no computerized databases of criminal records. no centralized national systems for cross-referencing offenses across jurisdictions. There was no established framework, no academic literature, no FBI training program, no shared vocabulary for thinking about what we now call serial killers. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which developed modern criminal profiling and which gave investigators tools for thinking about the psychology and patterns of repeat offenders, wasn't established until 1972. In 1962, detectives working a series of murders that appeared to be connected were operating almost entirely on instinct, experience, and the painstaking accumulation of physical evidence and witness testimony. The physical evidence in the Boston Strangler cases was minimal. The absence of forced entry, which was consistent across almost all the cases, meant there were no broken locks or damaged door frames to analyze. The careful nature of the crime scenes meant there were few accidental traces left behind. What fingerprints could be lifted were often partial or smudged or matched no one in the available databases. The ligatures, the belts, stockings, and scarves used in the murders were the victim's own property, which meant they couldn't be traced back to a purchaser. Witness testimony was equally limited. The killer, or killers, had apparently managed to enter and leave multiple apartment buildings without being reliably observed. People remembered seeing men in buildings at various times, but memory is fallible and frightened cities produce frightened witnesses who sometimes see things that confirm their fears rather than record them accurately. Attorney General Edward Brooks' decision to create a special coordinating unit was, in the context of its time, a genuinely important step. Prior to that, the murders in different cities, Boston proper, Lynn, Salem, Lawrence, were being investigated by different police departments with no formalized mechanism for sharing information. Creating a central coordinating body meant that investigators could at least be looking at all the cases together, comparing details, noting similarities and differences. The unit was staffed with experienced detectives and worked closely with the county prosecutor's offices. But coordination, however valuable, couldn't compensate for the absence of physical evidence. And the pressure being exerted by the public and the press was immense. By the autumn of 1962, the Boston Strangler, a name coined by the newspapers, not by investigators, had become a national story. The city was locked into a state of sustained anxiety. Women's groups were demanding action. Politicians were being asked at every appearance what was being done. The investigators working the case were doing so under a level of scrutiny that made careful, methodical police work considerably harder. Into this pressure cooker, in the autumn of 1962, came one of the stranger detours in the history of American crime investigation. Peter Hurkos was a Dutch national who claimed to have developed psychic abilities following a head injury he sustained in a fall during the Second World War. By the early 1960s, he had built a reputation, particularly in American popular culture, where interest in the paranormal was substantial, as a psychic detective who had assisted police in various unsolved cases. He was not brought in by the Boston Police Department or by Attorney General Brooks' unit. He was brought in by a private donor, a businessman who believed Hurkos might be able to do what conventional investigation had failed to do. Hurkos came to Boston in January 1964. He examined crime scene evidence, handled items belonging to the victims, and spent several days immersed in the case. And then he named a suspect. With apparent confidence and considerable specificity, he identified a man he believed to be the Boston Strangler. The man he named was a shoe salesman living in the Boston area. He had no significant criminal record. He was, by the account of everyone who investigated the lead, entirely innocent of the murders. The Hurkos episode is easy to mock from a distance of 60 years. But it is worth pausing on what it tells us about the state of the investigation at that point. The fact that a private donor could hire a self-described psychic and bring him to Boston to examine evidence in an active murder investigation, and that this was treated, at least in some quarters, as a legitimate investigative avenue, speaks to the degree of desperation that had set in. 18 months in, with 13 women dead and no suspect and no physical evidence pointing toward an individual, the conventional tools had produced nothing. The pressure to do something, to produce someone, was enormous. That pressure would prove to have consequences. What the investigation had produced, by the time the Strangler murders appeared to stop in January 1964, was an enormous amount of information that didn't cohere into a clear picture. Thousands of people had been interviewed. Hundreds of persons of interest had been identified and cleared. The detectives on the case had done everything that could be done, by the standards of their era, and they had arrived at nothing conclusive. The city was exhausted by its fear. And then, 10 months after Mary Sullivan's death, everything seemed to change. A man in custody for an unrelated crime started talking. Chapter 4: Albert DeSalvo. Albert DeSalvo was 33 years old when he was arrested in November 1964, not for the Strangler murders, but for a series of sexual assaults that Boston police referred to as the Green Man crimes, so called because the perpetrator wore green work clothes. He was a married man with 2 children, a former Army soldier, a factory worker and handyman who lived in Malden, a working-class suburb north of Boston. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, someone who immediately presented as dangerous. He was described as friendly, sociable, likable even. He had a habit of talking, of filling silences, of making conversation. He was the sort of person who could put someone at ease. He also had a prior record that, in retrospect, takes on considerable significance. In the late 1950s, he had engaged in a series of incidents in which he knocked on the doors of young women's apartments, introduced himself as a scout for a modeling agency, talked his way inside, measured the women while describing the modeling careers available to them, and left without apparent incident. He was eventually arrested for this behavior in 1960, charged with breaking and entering, and served a relatively brief sentence. He was known to police, in other words. And the method, the talking his way into apartments, the presentation of himself as someone with a legitimate reason to be there, would later seem eerily consistent with what investigators believed about how the Strangler had gained access to his victims' homes. But in 1960, when DeSalvo was known to police for the modeling scout incidents, there were no Strangler murders yet. And when the Strangler murders began in 1962, DeSalvo doesn't appear to have been a significant person of interest, at least not initially. His name was presumably in files somewhere. The investigation had gathered names from everywhere, but he was not near the top of the list. Then came November 1964, the Green Man arrests, and the Bridgewater State Hospital. DeSalvo was sent to Bridgewater for psychiatric evaluation, standard procedure for a defendant in a serious criminal case when questions about mental competency arose. Bridgewater was a secure facility, and among the other patients there was a man named George Nasser. Nasser was a convicted murderer serving a life sentence, and he was considered by many who encountered him to be a genuinely intelligent and manipulative individual. He and DeSalvo began talking. What they talked about, and what exactly passed between them, would become one of the central disputed questions of the entire Boston Strangler case. What is known is that DeSalvo began making references to the Strangler murders. What is also known is that Nasser contacted his attorney, Lee Bailey, and told him that the man in Bridgewater with him was claiming to be the Boston Strangler. Bailey went to Bridgewater, met DeSalvo, and subsequently agreed to represent him. Lee Bailey was, in 1964, at the very beginning of what would become an extraordinarily prominent legal career. He was brilliant, ambitious, and understood very well that representing the Boston Strangler, if the confession held up, would be a career-defining case. He arranged for DeSalvo to give a detailed, recorded confession. And what DeSalvo gave him was extraordinary. The confession was long. It was specific. It covered all 13 murders, one by one, in considerable detail. DeSalvo described the circumstances of each crime, how he had gotten into the apartments, what the women had said to him, what had happened. He described physical details of the crime scenes that had never been made public, details about furniture arrangement, about the positioning of victims, about specific items in the apartments. These details, investigators confirmed, were accurate. How did he know them? This was the question at the heart of everything. The argument for DeSalvo's guilt was straightforward. He knew things that only the killer could have known. The confession had the ring of genuine memory, of a person recalling specific experiences rather than reciting facts that had been fed to him. The detail was too granular, too specific, too accurate to be fabricated. But even as the confession was being taken, Questions were accumulating. Questions about DeSalvo's state of mind, about his relationship with Nasser, about his motivations. DeSalvo was a man with a significant mental health history, a chameleon-like ability to adapt to his social environment, and a demonstrable talent for reading and responding to the expectations of the people around him. He had spent time in Bridgewater talking to Nasser, a man with connections, intelligence, and for reasons that remain debated, a possible interest in DeSalvo confessing to the Strangler murders. Why would DeSalvo confess to 13 murders he didn't commit? The question seems almost too large to take seriously. Confessing to 13 murders meant confessing to the worst things it's possible to do. But DeSalvo's situation in late 1964 was this. He was already facing conviction and a substantial prison sentence for the Green Man assaults. He was not going to avoid prison. And he had told people, including members of his own family, that he wanted the world to understand him, that he wanted his story to be told. There is also the question, which some investigators raised quite openly, of whether Bailey and Nasser had discussed some kind of financial arrangement, whether a book or film deal might provide money for DeSalvo's family, something that might come about only if DeSalvo was the strangler, only if the story was that large. None of this was ever proven. But the circumstance had the shape of something complicated. The Albert DeSalvo who confessed to the Boston Strangler murders was not a simple man. He was not a straightforward monster, which would have been, in some ways, easier to understand. He was a person with a difficult history, a complicated psychology, and a set of motivations that, even now, are not entirely clear. And his confession, for all its apparent detail, was from the beginning something that serious investigators found genuinely troubling. Chapter 5. The Confession and Its Problems. The confession, on its surface, was compelling. You have to give it that. When investigators first heard DeSalvo describing the murders, the specific details, the accurate physical descriptions, the apparent intimacy of genuine memory, there was a natural human tendency to believe that no one could know these things unless they had been there. And the confession was taken seriously, at least initially, by many of the people who heard it. But investigators are not supposed to be moved by compelling narratives alone. They are supposed to test those narratives against the known facts. And when the prosecutors of Suffolk County and the other relevant jurisdictions examined DeSalvo's confession carefully, statement by statement, detail by detail, what they found was more complicated than it appeared. The errors were specific and they were significant. DeSalvo got details wrong. Not minor, peripheral details that anyone might misremember, but details that a person who had actually been inside those apartments and committed those crimes would be expected to know with certainty. He described furniture in wrong positions. He described aspects of crime scenes inaccurately. In some cases, when these errors were pointed out to him, when investigators, perhaps inadvertently, corrected him, he adjusted his account to match the correct information. That pattern is precisely what you would expect to see in someone who was reciting information they had been given, filling in gaps when those gaps were exposed, rather than retrieving genuine memories. The prosecutors examined the confession and made a decision that was, in the context of what the city had been through and what the public expected, genuinely remarkable. They decided not to try DeSalvo for the Strangler murders. Let that land for a moment. The man who had confessed, on tape in extraordinary detail, to 13 of the most notorious murders in Massachusetts history was not going to be tried for those murders. The prosecutors who had heard the confession and had access to the full investigative record decided that they could not make the case. The confession alone, without corroborating physical evidence connecting DeSalvo to the crime scenes, was not enough. And the errors in the confession, the inaccuracies and the corrections, were enough to introduce a doubt that made prosecution untenable. DeSalvo was instead tried for the Green Man sexual assaults, a crime for which the evidence was strong and direct. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He was never formally charged with any of the 13 murders he had confessed to. In the eyes of the law, the Boston Strangler murders remained officially unsolved. Anna Sleezers and Nina Nichols and Helen Blake and Ida Erga and Jane Sullivan and Sophie Clark and Pamela Mason and Beverly Simmons and Evelyn Corbin and Joanne Graff and the 6 other women, their murders had no official answer. A man had said he did it, and the legal system had looked at what he said and decided it couldn't prove it. Among the investigators who had worked the case from the beginning, the reaction to the confession was divided. Some believed DeSalvo genuinely was the strangler, that the errors in the confession were the kinds of distortions that appear in anyone's memory of traumatic events, that the accurate details were too numerous and too specific to be explained any other way. These investigators felt that the prosecutor's decision not to try DeSalvo was an excess of caution, a failure of nerve in the face of public scrutiny. Others were not convinced from the start, and they remained unconvinced. The theory that they found most troubling and most plausible involved George Nassar. Nassar was a convicted murderer who had spent time in the criminal underworld of Boston. He had connections, contacts, access to information that moved through channels outside official investigation. The theory ran like this. Nassar had somehow acquired detailed knowledge of the Strangler crimes, either because he had committed some of them, or because someone in his network had, or simply because the Boston criminal underworld had access to information that had leaked from investigators or from people connected to the victims. And Nassar, for reasons of his own, perhaps to generate a legal profile for himself, perhaps for financial reasons connected to the book and film deals that would inevitably follow, perhaps for reasons that remain entirely opaque, had shared that information with DeSalvo and encouraged him to confess. Under this theory, DeSalvo's confession was not a fabrication in the sense of being invented from nothing. It was a performance that was possible because he had been given the information he needed to perform it. The accurate details were accurate because Nassar had told him what those details were. The errors were errors because the information was incomplete, because not everything had been shared or remembered correctly. And DeSalvo, who was already going to prison, who craved attention and wanted his story told, who had demonstrated throughout his life a remarkable capacity to tell people what they wanted to hear, DeSalvo had performed the confession with the natural fluency of someone who had spent his whole life managing impressions. This theory could not be proven. Nassar denied it. DeSalvo, for his part, continued to insist in the years after his conviction that he was the Boston Strangler, although there are accounts, from people who visited him in prison, from members of his family, that suggest he may have told different stories in private. He was stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison in November 1973, before he could be questioned more systematically. The identity of his killer was established, but the motive was never definitively determined. He died with his Chapter 6, The Death of DeSalvo. And there he stayed. Albert DeSalvo sat in Walpole State Prison, serving a life sentence for crimes that were not the Strangler murders, having confessed to crimes he was never formally charged with. And the case, if you can call it a case when no one was ever convicted, sat in an uncomfortable legal limbo for years, until 1973, when DeSalvo was found dead in his prison cell. It was the morning of November 25, 1973, a Monday, the day after Thanksgiving. Albert DeSalvo was 42 years old, and he had been in Walpole, the Massachusetts correctional institution at Cedar Junction, though most people still called it Walpole, for the better part of a decade. He had been transferred there from Bridgewater State Hospital, where he had spent time following his arrest, and he had carved out a strange kind of existence inside those walls. Famous in the way that only certain prisoners become famous, known by name to people who had never met him, the subject of books and articles and a major Hollywood film, while simultaneously being completely removed from any ability to shape his own narrative. He had talked to journalists. He had granted interviews. He had, in the year before his death, been making noises about recanting his confession, or at least about revealing new information that he claimed would change everything. Whether that was true, or a gambit for attention, or a bargaining chip for some legal maneuver he hoped to make, no one can now say. Because on that cold November morning, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary, where he had been sleeping. He had been stabbed 16 times. The weapon was never recovered. The killer was never identified. No one was ever charged with his murder. And in that fact, the fact that the self-proclaimed Boston Strangler was himself murdered by a person who was never caught, there is an irony so complete that it almost feels like it was constructed, as if history itself had a sense of dramatic proportion. Think about what that means for a moment. The man who had placed himself at the center of one of the most publicized criminal cases in American history, who had confessed in elaborate detail to 13 murders, who had become the public face of a terror that had gripped an entire city, that man was killed by an unknown assailant in a prison, and the investigation into his death went nowhere. The case was never solved. His killer, whoever they were, presumably returned to their cell, and eventually, presumably, left prison at some point, and went on with their life. We do not know who killed Albert DeSalvo. We may never know. There is something in that which demands a moment of genuine reflection, even setting aside every question of guilt and innocence. A man was killed in a place where the state was responsible for his safety. He was killed in circumstances that suggested someone either wanted him silenced or simply wanted him dead, and the system that had housed him, that had accepted his confession, that had in many ways built its resolution of a massive public case on his word, that system never answered for his death. It could not even answer the most basic question: who stabbed Albert DeSalvo 16 times and walked away? Some people, in the years since, have speculated that DeSalvo was killed precisely because he was about to reveal something about the Strangler murders, about other people who might have been involved, about the nature of his own confession. That is a theory. It is not provable. What is provable is that in the days before his death, DeSalvo had reportedly told his brother Richard that he was afraid, that he had been threatened, and that he had information he intended to share with investigators. What that information was, he took with him. With DeSalvo's death went the only person who had ever claimed first-hand knowledge of all 13 murders, whatever that knowledge actually consisted of. And that qualifier matters, because it was already becoming clear to serious investigators that the detailed nature of DeSalvo's confession was not, on its own, proof that he had been present at those crimes. Details can be learned. Information can be passed between people. A confession, however vivid, is not the same thing as evidence. And yet, for years, DeSalvo's confession had functioned as the de facto resolution to the Boston Strangler case. His death meant he could never be cross-examined, never tried, never forced, in a courtroom with lawyers present and a jury watching, to prove that he knew what he claimed to know. He could never be confronted with the inconsistencies in his account and asked to explain them. Every door that might have led to a definitive answer, one way or the other, closed on the morning of November 25, 1973, in a prison infirmary in Massachusetts. The official case, already in legal limbo, became permanently unresolvable in the most human sense. There was no one left to convict. There was no one left to exonerate. There was just the confession and the doubt, and 13 women who had been murdered between 1962 and 1964, and a city that had long since moved on. The Boston Strangler, the case, the investigation, the terrible chapter in American criminal history, had ended not with a verdict, not with justice, but with a body on a prison floor and a mystery folded inside a mystery. Chapter 7. The Doubts Grow. The thing about doubt is that it tends not to arrive all at once. It accumulates. It gathers in corners, in the margins of case files, in the private conversations of detectives who go home at night and lie awake thinking about something that doesn't quite add up. The doubts about Albert DeSalvo's guilt in the Boston Strangler murders had existed from the very beginning, from the moment he first began confessing to John Bottomley in 1964. But in the years after DeSalvo's death, those doubts became louder, more public, harder to dismiss. Several of the detectives who had worked the original case had always been skeptical. John Donovan, who had been one of the investigators assigned to the Strangler Task Force, was among those who had never been fully convinced. James Mellon, another experienced investigator with direct knowledge of the evidence, held similar reservations. These were not armchair critics or conspiracy theorists. These were men who had been inside the crime scenes, who had read every piece of evidence, who had interviewed witnesses and reviewed the physical details of each murder with the kind of attention that only comes from professional proximity to a case. And what they saw, repeatedly, was a confession that did not always match what they knew. The problems were real and they were documented. DeSalvo, in his confession sessions with Bottomley, got details wrong. Not minor details, details that the actual perpetrator should have known with certainty. He described the positions of bodies incorrectly. He misremembered the colors of clothing. In at least one case, he described a scene in a way that was directly contradicted by the physical evidence that investigators had collected. Now, you might argue that memory is imperfect, that trauma distorts, that the passage of time between the murders and the confession would naturally introduce errors. And that is fair. But the errors were not random. In some cases, investigators noted that the information DeSalvo provided seemed to track not with what was actually at the crime scenes, but with what had been reported in newspapers. He appeared, in those moments, to be remembering press coverage rather than personal experience. This was one of the most troubling threads in the entire case, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. In the early 1960s, the Boston Strangler murders received enormous press coverage. The details of each killing, the victims' names, their ages, where they lived, the general circumstances of their deaths, were widely reported. A person who read every newspaper article about the murders carefully would have known a great deal. Not everything, because investigators withheld certain details from the press as a matter of standard practice, but enough to construct a plausible-sounding account. Enough, possibly, to pass a casual interview with a lawyer who was under pressure to close a high-profile case. What was never established, to the satisfaction of all the investigators involved, was that DeSalvo knew the specific withheld details, the things that only the killer could have known, in sufficient number and with sufficient accuracy to make the confession definitive. Some investigators went further than skepticism about particular details. They argued something more fundamental, that the 13 murders attributed to the Boston Strangler might not all be the work of a single person. This was a genuinely radical idea at the time, because the entire cultural and investigative framework of the case had been built around the idea of one man, one predator, moving through the city. But when you look at the victims dispassionately, the picture is not as consistent as the narrative suggests. The early victims were older women, in their 50s and 60s and 70s. The later victims were younger, in their 20s. The methods overlapped but were not identical. The geographic spread was wide. Some investigators believed that what the press and the public had called the Boston Strangler might actually have been several different killers, their crimes grouped together because the method, strangulation in a home setting, provided a superficial similarity that the media latched onto and the investigation subsequently organized itself around. If that is true, and it is worth emphasizing that it is a theory, not a proven fact, then what it means is almost unbearable to contemplate. It means that the system accepted a single confession that may have covered crimes committed by multiple people, that those other perpetrators may have gone free, and that the families of the victims spent decades with a false resolution. It means that justice, real justice, the kind that identifies the actual person responsible and holds them accountable, was never delivered to some of those 13 women at all. Mary Sullivan's family became one of the most prominent voices raising these concerns publicly. Mary Sullivan was 20 years old when she was murdered in her apartment on Charles Street in Boston on January 4, 1964. She was the last woman attributed to the Strangler, and she had been in Boston for only a few weeks, having moved from Cape Cod to start a new chapter of her life. Her nephew, Casey Sherman, who was not yet born when his aunt was killed, but who grew up in the shadow of her death and its effect on his family, began, in the 1990s, a sustained and serious effort to reopen the investigation into her murder. Sherman wrote about it, spoke about it publicly, and, crucially, pushed for scientific examination of the evidence that had been collected from Sullivan's apartment in 1964. The families of other victims also spoke out over the years. The response from official channels was, for a long time, muted. The case was closed. DeSalvo had confessed. There was no active investigation. For the families who doubted that resolution, that official silence must have been an additional wound, the sense that the system which had failed to properly investigate, which had accepted a confession that serious professionals questioned, was now treating that failure as a closed chapter, something to be filed away rather than re-examined. The doubts about Albert DeSalvo's guilt in the Boston Strangler murders are not fringe theories. That is the most important thing to hold on to as you listen to this. They were shared by experienced detectives with direct knowledge of the evidence. They were grounded in documented inconsistencies in the confession. They were articulated by people who had every professional reason to want the case to be clean and closed and resolved, and who nonetheless could not, in good conscience, call it that. And so the questions kept living underneath the official resolution, waiting for the kind of evidence that 1960s forensics could not provide. That evidence would not arrive for decades. But when it did, it arrived in a form that no one in 1964 could have imagined. Chapter 8. The 2013 DNA Evidence. The year 2013 was not supposed to be a year of revelation in the Boston Strangler case. The case had been functionally closed for decades. Albert DeSalvo had been dead for 40 years. The original investigators were mostly gone. The physical evidence from the crimes, what remained of it, had sat in storage for half a century. And yet 2013 became the most significant year in the history of this case since DeSalvo first began confessing to John Bottomley in 1964. Because in 2013, science arrived where law enforcement never fully had. The story really begins with Casey Sherman. Mary Sullivan's nephew had been living with this case for most of his adult life. His family had been shaped by his aunt's murder, by her absence, by the grief that never fully resolved, by the way the official version of events had always felt incomplete and inadequate to those who had loved her. Sherman had investigated the case himself, had written a book about it, and had become increasingly convinced that Albert DeSalvo had not killed Mary Sullivan. Not because he had a different suspect, but because the evidence, when you examined it honestly, did not support the certainty with which DeSalvo had been given credit for the crime. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Sherman, working with Mary Sullivan's immediate family, pursued the legal and bureaucratic processes necessary to allow scientific examination of the available evidence. This was not simple. It required exhumation. It required legal agreements about the handling and testing of human remains. It required, ultimately, the cooperation of authorities who had to be convinced that the effort was warranted. But in 2001, Mary Sullivan's remains were exhumed, and biological material that had been preserved from the crime scene in 1964. This was an era before DNA testing existed, but investigators had collected and retained biological evidence as a matter of routine, was submitted for analysis. The initial results in 2001 were suggestive but not conclusive. There was DNA present in the biological material collected from the Sullivan crime scene, but without DeSalvo's DNA for comparison, the analysis could not go further. DeSalvo had been buried in a Catholic cemetery in Massachusetts, and obtaining a sample from his remains required its own legal process. That process moved slowly, as these things tend to do. For years, the effort stalled. Then, in 2012 and 2013, the investigation accelerated. Albert DeSalvo's remains were exhumed. DNA was extracted, and the comparison was made. The result, announced in July of 2013, was significant. DNA evidence found at the Mary Sullivan crime scene, biological material that had been collected in January of 1964 and preserved for nearly 50 years, was matched to Albert DeSalvo. The match was described by investigators as definitive. After decades of doubt, after years of his family and serious investigators questioning whether DeSalvo had any real connection to at least this final murder, science had placed him at the scene. You need to hold two things in your mind at once here, because this is where the story becomes genuinely complicated and where intellectual honesty requires a little more precision than the headline version of events tends to offer. The first thing is that this was real. This was meaningful. Boston Strangler DNA evidence connecting DeSalvo to the Sullivan murder, that was not a minor development. For years, the case had existed in a world of words, confessions, testimonies, interviews, press coverage. The DNA evidence was physical. It was scientific. It represented a form of connection between DeSalvo and the Sullivan crime scene that could not be attributed to newspaper reading or clever lawyering or the suggestibility of a man who craved attention. Something biological, something that had been part of Albert DeSalvo, had been present in Mary Sullivan's apartment on the night she was murdered. The second thing is that DNA evidence, even definitive DNA evidence, does not automatically resolve every question. Presence at a crime scene is not the same as guilt for the crime. It establishes that DeSalvo was there. It does not, on its own, tell us everything about what happened in that apartment on January 4, 1964. And, critically, it addresses only one of the 13 murders attributed to the Boston Strangler. The 2013 DNA findings say something real and important about the Sullivan murder. They do not say anything direct about the 12 other women. Whether DeSalvo killed all of them, some of them, or only Mary Sullivan remains, from a strictly scientific standpoint, an open question. There is also the question, a genuinely difficult one, of whether the DNA evidence resolves the concerns about how DeSalvo's confession was obtained. Even if we accept, on the basis of the DNA, that DeSalvo killed Mary Sullivan, the problematic aspects of the confession process remain. The deal struck between F. Lee Bailey and the Attorney General's office. The lack of proper legal representation during the confession sessions. The documented inconsistencies in the account DeSalvo gave. The fact that he was never tried. None of that is changed by the DNA result. What the 2013 analysis does is add a layer of physical evidence to a case that had previously rested almost entirely on a confession, and that is genuinely important. But it does not transform a complicated, contested case into a clean and simple one. What it did do, perhaps most importantly, was demonstrate that the application of modern forensic science to evidence from this era can yield real results. The material collected in 1964, by investigators working with the tools and knowledge of that time, was preserved well enough to provide usable DNA half a century later. That is remarkable. And it raises a question that the families of the other 12 victims have every right to ask. If DNA evidence could be recovered from Mary Sullivan's crime scene after 50 years, what might be available from the other scenes? Whether those questions will ever be fully pursued, whether there is evidence remaining to be tested, and whether the institutional will exist to pursue it, is something the record does not yet answer. What the 2013 developments in the Boston Strangler case gave us was not resolution. They gave us something more valuable and more unsettling. A confirmed connection between DeSalvo and at least one murder, wrapped in a set of questions that the DNA itself could not answer. Which is, when you think about it, a fairly accurate summary of where this entire case has always lived, somewhere between what we know and what we can prove. Chapter 9. What the case means for criminal justice. Every generation of American criminal justice has its landmark cases, the cases that reveal where the system is working and, more importantly, where it is not. The cases that become teaching moments, cautionary tales, the foundations on which reforms are built. The Boston Strangler case is one of those cases. Not because it was the most violent, not because the perpetrator was the most sophisticated, but because of the specific ways in which the system failed, and because those failures were quiet enough, and official enough, and wrapped in enough procedural legitimacy that they were nearly invisible while they were happening. The confession problem is the place to start. In the early 1960s, a detailed confession was, for most practical purposes, treated as sufficient resolution of a criminal case. The psychology of false confession, the documented fact that people confess to crimes they did not commit, for a range of reasons including psychological pressure, mental illness, desire for notoriety, fear, and the dynamics of interrogation itself, was not yet well understood in mainstream legal and law enforcement culture. The idea that a person might confess in elaborate detail to murders they had not committed, and do so in a way that sounded convincing, was difficult for most people to fully accept. DeSalvo's confession, with its specific scene descriptions and its emotional texture, felt like the truth because confessions were supposed to feel like the truth. What the Boston Strangler case helped establish, over the decades that followed, was that a confession must be corroborated by independent physical evidence before it can be treated as reliable. This sounds obvious now. In some ways it is obvious. But in 1964, the system accepted DeSalvo's confession without that corroboration, accepted it informally, through a legal arrangement that was never subjected to the scrutiny of a trial, and treated it as closure. The lesson the case taught, slowly and painfully, was that closure built on an uncorroborated confession is not really closure at all. It is a story that the system has told itself. And when the story turns out to be incomplete or wrong, the people who suffer for it are the families of the victims and, potentially, a person who confessed to something they did not do. The case also contributed in ways that are not always directly credited to the development of modern criminal profiling. The inconsistency of the Boston Strangler's victims, the range across age, background, and circumstance, was one of the early cases that serious investigators used to ask fundamental questions about criminal behavior. Can a single perpetrator be responsible for victims who vary this dramatically? What does that variation tell us about motive, about method, about the psychology of the offender? The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which developed formal criminal profiling methodology in the 1970s and 1980s, built on exactly these kinds of questions. The Boston Strangler case, with its unresolved questions about whether one or multiple perpetrators were responsible, was part of the intellectual raw material from which modern profiling grew. And then there is the deeper philosophical question, the one that sits underneath all the forensic and procedural issues and refuses to go away. What does justice mean in a case like this? Think about what actually happened. 13 women were murdered. The public was given a resolution in the form of a confession. The man who made that confession was never tried. He was imprisoned for other crimes. He died in prison. The confession, which may have been accurate, or may have been partially accurate, or may have been a fabrication constructed from newspaper accounts and a complicated psychology, was never tested in the way that our justice system is designed to test evidence, adversarially, in open court, with a jury of citizens evaluating it and a defense attorney pushing back against it. The process that should have happened never happened. And if DeSalvo did not commit all 13 murders, then the people who did may have lived out their lives without consequence. That is not a small failure. That is a failure at the most fundamental level of what a justice system is supposed to do. It is supposed to identify the guilty and protect the innocent, and in this case, it may have done neither with confidence for anyone involved. The families of the victims deserved better. Albert DeSalvo, if he was innocent of some or all of the murders, deserved better. The city of Boston deserved better. And the broader public, whose trust in the justice system depends on that system actually doing what it claims to do, deserved better. The Boston Strangler case is not just a true crime story. It is a study in how the pressure to close a case, the institutional, social, and political pressure to give a frightened public a resolution, can lead a system to accept less certainty than it should. It is a cautionary tale about confession evidence and the seductive completeness that a detailed account seems to provide. And it is a reminder that the measure of a justice system is not how quickly it reaches a conclusion, but how honestly it pursues the truth. Chapter 10. The Unanswered Questions. Here is where we are all these years later. Here is what we know, and what we do not know, and what we may never know. Albert DeSalvo is dead. He has been dead since 1973, killed in a prison where he was serving a sentence for crimes that were not the Strangler murders. The DNA evidence collected from Mary Sullivan's crime scene and matched to DeSalvo in 2013 places him at that scene, connects him, physically and definitively, to at least that one murder. The confession he made in 1964, detailed and dramatic and full of documented inconsistencies, sits in the historical record as the only first-person account that has ever been given of those 13 deaths. And that is where certainty ends. Some investigators who have spent time with this case believe DeSalvo committed all 13 murders. They point to the DNA evidence. They point to the specificity of the confession in its strongest moments. They argue that the inconsistencies are explicable by the passage of time and the psychology of a man describing crimes in retrospect, and that the overall weight of the evidence, including the fact that the Strangler murders stopped when DeSalvo was taken off the streets, points toward his guilt across the board. Some believe he committed some of the murders, that he was responsible for a subset of the killings, perhaps the later ones or the ones whose profile matched his documented pattern of behavior most closely, and that other crimes were attributed to him, either by design, to close cases that investigators could not otherwise solve, or through the simple human tendency to fit available evidence to an existing narrative once that narrative has been established. Some believe he committed none of them, that his confession was constructed from second-hand knowledge, that his psychology made him susceptible to claiming responsibility for crimes that would make him famous and important, and that the real killers, possibly multiple people, were never identified and never faced consequences. The families of the victims have lived with this uncertainty for more than 60 years now. 60 years of a question that the system told them was answered, and that kept turning out not to be. Casey Sherman and Mary Sullivan's family pushed harder than anyone to reopen the investigation, to apply modern science to old evidence, to demand that the official resolution of the case be tested rather than simply accepted. The 2013 DNA findings gave them something real. It did not give them peace, not entirely, because peace in a case like this would require a certainty that the evidence cannot provide. The case is officially closed. There is no active investigation into the Boston Strangler murders. There is no prospect of new charges. Everyone who might have been charged is either dead or unknown. There is no possibility of trial. There is only the record. What the record shows is 13 women who were murdered in their homes in Boston between June 1962 and January 1964. Women who had done nothing except live in a city where someone, or perhaps more than one someone, was killing. A man who confessed to those murders and was never tried for them. A justice system that accepted an arrangement it should have tested. A confession that held up in public perception for decades before its weaknesses became undeniable. And a piece of DNA evidence that confirmed one connection while leaving the larger picture still unresolved. 13 women. Each of them with a name, a life, a family, a story that had nothing to do with the story they ended up being part of. Anna Sleezers, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Erga, Jane Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Beverly Simmons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, Mary Sullivan, and the woman some investigators dispute as belonging to the series at all, Helen Jackson. Each of them deserves better than to be a chapter in an unresolved story. Each of them deserves the specific, individual attention of a justice system doing its best work. They did not receive that. The most honest thing we can say, sitting here now, is that they did not receive that, and we should hold that fact with the weight it deserves. Some questions, the really important ones, have a way of remaining open even when we desperately want to close them. The Boston Strangler case is one of those questions. And it keeps asking to be heard. Go back to Boston for a moment. Not the Boston of 2013 DNA results and legal arguments and forensic laboratories, but the Boston of 1962. The summer. June, when the days were long and the heat settled over the old brick neighborhoods and the windows were open to catch whatever breeze came off the water. Picture the apartment buildings on Gainsborough Street and Newhall Street and the quieter residential blocks of Commonwealth Avenue. The women who lived in those apartments, women who lived alone or with roommates, who had jobs and friends and routines, who moved through their days with the ordinary confidence that most of us carry without noticing it. The confidence that comes from living in a city you know, a city that is familiar and navigable and safe enough. That summer, something changed. Something came into those streets and into those buildings and into the ordinary texture of those lives, and the confidence cracked. People started checking their locks. Started hesitating at the sound of a knock. Started moving through their own homes with a new self-consciousness, a new awareness of doors and windows and the space between themselves and whatever was outside. A city of locked doors. That specific fear, not a fear with a face or a name, but a fear that attached itself to the ordinary domestic details of life, settled over Boston in a way that cities do not easily forget. The Boston Strangler case changed things. It changed how Americans thought about the safety of their own homes. The assumption, which turned out to be less solid than anyone had realized, that the inside of your own apartment was a protected space. It changed how people thought about confession evidence and the limits of what a dramatic account, however detailed, can actually prove. It raised questions about what justice truly requires. Not the appearance of resolution, not the comfort of a name attached to a crime, but the actual, rigorous, scrutinized work of establishing what happened and who is responsible. Those are questions the case raised in 1964 and never fully answered. They are questions it is still raising now. There is something in that which is worth carrying with you, not anxiously, not with dread, but with the quiet respect that difficult truths deserve. The cases that stay open longest are sometimes the ones that matter most. Not because they will ever be solved, necessarily. Not because any answer is still coming for the families who have waited decades for one. But because the questions they raise, about truth and justice and what we owe each other and what the system owes the people it is built to protect, keep asking to be heard. They refuse to be filed away. They outlast the investigators and the lawyers and the men who confessed and the men who doubted and the men who gave up. They persist. And there is something almost insistent about that persistence, as if the questions themselves are a form of remembrance for the women who can no longer speak for themselves. Now rest. Boston is quiet tonight. It usually is. The streets that once held all that fear are ordinary streets again, full of coffee shops and students and people walking dogs in the evening cool, people who may not know the names Anna Sleezers or Mary Sullivan, who may never have heard of Albert DeSalvo or thought about what it means for a city to live through a terror it could not explain. That forgetting is part of how cities survive. But somewhere in the archive, in the case files and the DNA reports and the notebooks of detectives who went home at night unable to stop thinking about what didn't add up, 13 women are still waiting for the fullness of what they were owed. And the questions they left behind, questions about truth, about certainty, about what it means to call something justice, float through the quiet city like something that was never quite resolved. Sleep well. The night is still.